Hello, hello, and welcome back to me reading books aloud. Yeah, okay. Chapter 3 The Extruder. Derek rode the aqueduct like a log in a sluice, his body numb, his senses and his fate out of control. The waters raged in his ears as his entire existence turned on the simple act of trying to keep his head above water. Nothing else mattered. Life had reduced itself to its essence. There was no fear, no time for it, and any yearnings to have his life pass before his eyes went unsatisfied, since he had no life to reflect upon. There was only the water and the numbing cold, the ubiquitous companionship of death. His ride could have lasted a minute or an eternity. He was beyond calculating time. But when he felt himself free falling midair, his brain snapped to the new reality and questioned. He was falling, surrounded by a hot, moist wind. A bare glow of light seemed to envelop him. But before he had a chance to appreciate it, he splashed into hot water. He had gulped down water with his quickly sucked breath, and when he bobbed to the surface like a cork, he was choking and coughing, his head pounding with a heartbeat throb. He panicked, then forced himself into control when he realized the water he was in wasn't flowing, but pooling. As he treaded water, he found himself grateful to his former life for giving him the life-saving advantage of swimming lessons. He leaned back and floated on his back, small currents pulling him this way and that. His body ached horribly from the battering he had taken in the aqueduct. Every bit of strength had drained from him. There was a ceiling of some sort above him, tiny lights making it dimly visible. The roar of waterfalls filled the hollow cavern completely, and he turned his head to the side to get a glimpse of his surroundings. He was 100 meters from the edge of a large square pool that stretched perhaps 1,000 meters across. Red lights at irregular intervals bathed the entire area in an eerie glow. In the middle of each side of the pool were aqueduct runoffs, 4 in all, their cascades shimmering like fading pulsars in the red haze. These 4 runoffs provided the incredible noise that churned inside his head, all of it echoing within the confined space. Where was he? A collection point of some kind? Perhaps a reservoir. Any city needed a water supply. This was probably connected to a water treatment plant meant to sustain the human population that didn't live there. This only strengthened Derek's earlier speculation that this was not a city simply meant for robots. What was going on here was serious colonization. Another realization occurred to him, too. The reservoir had saved his life. He had been showing the beginning signs of hypothermia during his wild ride down the aqueduct, but the hot water of the reservoir was thawing him out. Why hot water? The water was definitely warmer than human body temperature, perhaps as much as 15 degrees, and incredibly hot winds were raging through the chamber, competing with the charging runoff waters in the loudness. In fact, the soothing heat in the rest were already beginning to lull his senses, and he realized that if he wasn't careful, he could end up on the other end of the physical spectrum of hypothermia. Whether hypo or hyper, though, the results were still the same. He was going to have to get out of the water or risk overburdening his heart. Still on his back, he churned his legs lightly while propelling himself with his arms. There seemed to be robotic movement at the far end of the reservoir, but he didn't have the strength to swim that far. Having no idea of which way to go, he simply moved toward the closest shoreline. The process was time-consuming, though, for the runoffs created their own currents. He swam with leisure but determination, taking his time to check out his body. He had taken a beating in his wild ride down the aqueduct, but beside general bruises, nothing major seemed to be wrong. As he neared the edge of the pool, he could see that the runoff streams had slowed considerably, leading him to speculate that the rain had stopped outside. Fuzzy light was also beginning to seep in around the dark edges of the covered pool, and he realized that day had broken. He finally reached the edge of the pool, its surface made from the same materials as the rest of the city. Metal ladders were set at regular intervals around the edge, and he floated to the nearest one and began his climb out. The water was barely 3 meters from the top of the pool, and fortunately so, because as soon as Derek began his climb, he knew he wasn't doing well. His body, so light in the water, felt like it weighed a ton. The combination of emotional stress, the ordeal of the aqueduct, and the overheated water of the pool had all had an effect on his body. He dragged himself slowly up the ladder, then rolled, gasping onto the edge of the pool and lay there. He closed his eyes, just for a minute, and he was gone. He didn't know how long he had slept, but when he woke it was the start. A loud rumble assailed his hearing. He sat up quickly, darting his head around, and saw a large vehicle moving around the pool toward him, its engine's noises amplified to a roar in the cavern-like surroundings. Standing was a problem, since Derek still felt weak, but he got up on shaky legs and moved toward the areas of light beyond the reservoir. While he was still out and on the loose, he wanted to see as much as he could, for this time the robots wouldn't be so quick to let him out of their sight. As he moved toward the light, he passed open caverns that were filled with conduits for moving power. The huge pipes were twisted like knotted rope and seemed to be moving, writhing like a snake pit, almost as if they were alive. He was taken over these areas by railed walkways that simply extended from the edge of the pit at his approach, growing like crystals before his eyes. After the pits, he passed several squat buildings where he surmised the actual water treatment was performed. Drone robots moved in and out of the facilities rapidly, mostly moving machinery in both directions. Derek briefly considered going into one of the structures to search for a terminal, but the still approaching vehicle made him change his mind. "Human!" came a loudspeakered voice. "You will halt your progress where you are. It is unlawful for you to proceed." He turned to the sound. It was coming from a robot-controlled vehicle that was rapidly closing the distance on him. It was time to move. He ran past buildings and toward glowing walls of light just beyond. "Human!" the loudspeaker called again. He raced to the wall, his legs heavy. The entire area wall seemed lit and wrapped a circle around the reservoir area. It was translucent, like a shower curtain, and he realized that it was simply so thin that outside light passed right through. He pushed on it, but it felt solid. He pushed harder, and it gave under his hand, just like the wall last night. Just then he saw a drone approach the wall 20 meters distance and moved right through it. He hurried there, the robots in the vehicle closing rapidly on him. He stood at the spot, seeing no entry, but when he raised his hand to push against it, the wall iris opened and he stepped into the daylight. It was morning, bright and calm, with no sign of the deluge that had taken place the previous night. The sun was still low in the sky, but Robot City was alive and active. He was in the heart of it here, the hub upon which the wheel of the city turned. He could see the aqueduct that had brought him cutting through the city like a spoke, and he could see other aqueducts, other spokes, slicing through the wheel of the city, and began to think of the areas between the spokes as quadrants. Robots in large numbers hurried quickly through the streets, always going somewhere, always busy with predetermined tasks. Many of them were disappearing into the treatment plant. He moved a small distance from his exit point, then looked back at the reservoir, shocked to find a forest there. Then he realized the forest had been planted above the reservoir, the land area serving double duty. But why a forest? Not for robots, certainly. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a large wheeled vehicle that had been tracking him within the reservoir, moving through the exit point to the outside. He looked back at the city, then up at the forest. He would find escape in its random chaos. Angling himself away from his pursuers, he ran back towards the huge reservoir building, preparing to climb one of the struts that helped support the outside edge of the forest. But as soon as he reached the place and put his hands on the arched strut, it seemed to melt away, changing into a gentle sloping stairway. He hurried up the stairs without a question and entered the forest. The ground was moist and spongy, muddying his already soaked shoes. The trees were small, in many cases smaller than the underbrush that grew thick around them. A haze seemed to fill the entire forest, and the further he plunged into it, the hazier it became. Derek was no expert in vegetation, but he assumed the trees were all offspring, many generations removed, of trees that had once grown on Earth. Spacers, though hating to mention any connection to the planet of their ancestry, nevertheless made it a point to bring Earth vegetation and animal life to whatever planet they colonized. Where he'd gotten such information, he had no idea. The small glimpses of his own mind were maddened in their incompleteness. He wandered the forest, pushing through the haze and the dense undergrowth, feeling jittery and untamed surroundings. He knew these were also the feelings of a spacer pushing through his mind. He didn't much like the forest. He longed for the order of the city. But for a human being, this had its place. untamed but finite, aesthetically pleasing without being uncontrollable. This place existed for aesthetics, for human aesthetics. His foot hit something hard and uncompromising, and he tripped, going hard to soft ground, getting mud all over himself. He turned to the object that caused his fall and found a small section of pipe sticking out of the ground. A fog-like haze was pumping from the pipe, the same haze that filled the entire area, and Derek began to see a master plan at work here. He stood, then ducked when he saw a shadow moving through the haze, not 5 meters from him. It was one of the robots. He listened to hear them thrashing through the brush all around. They were slowly cordoning off the entire area, boxing him in. He took a deep breath, then scrunched up into a ball and lay on the ground, listening as they moved near him. The forest was built over the reservoirs so that condensing water could feed to the trees from beneath and nourish the roots directly. Further, the haze was probably carbon dioxide vapor feeding the forest to promote health and growth. Where did the CO2 come from? Perhaps bleed off from their industrial processes, which could also explain the heat in the reservoir area. The setup was sophisticated and civilized, a city built around its ecological needs. Was it all of robot design? A metal foot clanked down just as an arms reached away from his position. He stifled the urge to rise up for a breath of normal air. Within seconds, the robots moved on. As he heard the search party sweep past, he jumped to his feet and charged back in the direction he had come. The robots were much faster and stronger than he was, so he was going to have to make things happen quickly at this point. He reached the edge of the forest in minutes, then rushed to the place where he had climbed up. The strut was already solid again, the steps nowhere to be seen. He looked over the edge of the forest. It was 10 meters to the ground. Jumping was out of the question. "You, Derek!" came a robot voice behind. "Stop now! Stop!" He sat on the ground and dangled his legs over the edge of the strut. Steps miraculously formed again. He ran down just as several robots reached the edge of the forest, calling for him to stop. Amidst the confusion near the water treatment facility, he saw a large flatbed vehicle, filled with what looked like broken computers, ready to pull out. He took the last steps and leaps and charged the machine, the robots behind already reaching the bottom of the stairs. The truck pulled out before he reached it. With a burst of speed, he caught it and jumped into the back. A small round drone on the side of his head squeaked at him from among the broken computers. Catherine stood at the wash basin, watching the lukewarm water flow from the tap, and wondered how plumbing could possibly be accomplished in a city that didn't stand still. She splashed her face with water, then stared into the small mirror that was inset above the basin. Her eyes were puffy and dark, showing the results of no sleep, but her face remained calm, remarkably calm considering the terror that had flashed through her for most of the long night. He was gone, perhaps dead, and she was alone on this crazy world. Though David Derrick, whatever he wanted to call himself, had never looked at this place as anything but adventure, to her it was nothing but a prison. A first priority for anyone removed in a space report would be access to radio communications to inform search parties and anxious waiters. Yet the robot seemed reluctant, no, evasive when it came to the topic of communications. That frightened her more than anything else that was going on. "Did you sleep well?" She jumped to the sound, turning quickly to see Rydberg standing in the doorway, a light static issuing from his loudspeaker. "I didn't invite you in here," she said, anger and frustration. "Get out, now!" The robot turned without a word and moved from the door. Catherine followed him out into a small hallway. "What do you want?" she asked. "Has there been any news about Derek?" Rydberg turned back to her. "I did not mean to intrude on your privacy," he said. "Please accept my apologies. I have brought you food. I'm not hungry." Rydberg just stared at her. "Has there been any word about Derek?" she said again, softly this time. "Yes," the robot replied. "He was not seen not 3 decades ago, but ran away when another of our supervisors called to him." She clapped her hands together loudly. "So he's alive!" "Apparently so. Why would he run away? Is this a sign of guilt?" "It's a sign he wants to check out this crazy place without a gaggle of robots hanging all over him." She moved past him toward the living room. "Now where's that food? I'm so hungry I could eat a—" She stopped herself and looked at the robots. "I'm hungry." "But you just said—" "Forget what I said. Correction." She caught herself before the robot could explain its memory. Never mind. Where's the food? He led her back down the hall to the living room, where the food sat at the stone table she'd eaten it the night before. Strangely enough, the room was different, squatter, wider than it had been the previous night, the table closer to the wall. She quickly moved to the table. There was a variety of what appeared to be fruits and cooked vegetables there. She sat down tentatively and ate a small piece of greenish fruit. It was delicious. Rydberg stood nearby as she greedily sampled everything on the table, all of it good. She didn't invite this robot to sit with her as Derek had done. The machines were servants and needed to be treated as such. She'd never understand his insistence on treating them as anything other than the machines they were. "When do we get to make outside radio contact?" she asked once the initial hunger pangs had died down. "We will all meet later and discuss those questions." "Are you going to put us on trial?" she said, "for the murder of this other human? We are entitled to a trial, you know." "Rydberg has told us that he will try to solve this mystery," Rydberg said. Catherine stopped eating and stared at him. "And what if he doesn't? What if we don't ever discover what really happened? You have no right to hold us here as it is. We can't go on indefinitely like this." "If we cannot find the truth of the matter," Rydberg said, "then we will assume our original supposition to be correct." "I don't believe you," she said. "You have no right to determine my guilt or innocence without proper evidence. I am not Derek, and I hold no romantic visions of a robot-controlled world. You cannot be allowed to have any power over the way I live my life. If you want to hold me for murder, you must put me on a trial and prove it. If you put me on trial, I must be allowed to defend myself. I therefore demand immediate access to a radio so that I may provide myself with proper defense representation. I want a certified legal rep, and I want one now." "We will discuss the situation later today," the robot said, "after friend Derek has been returned to us. Meanwhile, your food is getting cold and will lose its appeal." "It already has," Catherine returned, pushing the plate away from herself. She didn't like the way this was turning. The radio seemed to get more and more distant to her, and with it any hopes of ever leaving this place. Her arguments to Rydberg is based solely on laws and customs common to Auroran society. But all law, all freedom was merely a rationalization away where a robot civilization was concerned. The final result to her was quite simple. The machines were in charge, and they could do anything they wanted. Derek knew nothing with which to compare the size of Robot City, but as he drove its berth, he couldn't help but feel its vastness. As the parts truck moved quickly through the city streets, the drone bounced from one machine to another, speaking loudly, its silver body lighting up in dozens of places, then winking out again as it performed automatic, but definitely sub-robotic, pre-troubleshooting functions on broken machinery. Finally it came to rest on Derek's lap, all of its lights blinking madly, its squeaks turning into a high-pitched whine. "So where are we going?" he asked the troubleshooter, while idly stroking its dome. The machine whirred and bounced, but never answered. All at once its whine turned into a loud, siren-like wail. "Stop it!" Derek ordered, turning to the front of the truck to make sure he wasn't attracting attention. He bent double over the thing, trying to muffle its sound without success. "You're going to have to stop," he told the thing. "I can't just—" It sent a jolt of electricity through its body, shocking Derek, moving him off. "All right," he pointed a shaking finger at the silver ball. "I don't have to take that from you." The thing started bouncing up and down, higher and higher. Derek looked both ways over the truck back, then calmly brought up a foot and shoved the thing right off the truck, where it hit the street angrily, its wail louder as it bounced around the rubber ball. Within a few blocks the vehicle slowed its pace, then got in line behind several other trucks, all filled with equipment. Derek got on his knees and looked over the piles of computers. The trucks were pulling up to a gate, where a whole line of robots were moving up to the truck back, each taking a single piece of equipment and returning with a blockhouse that wasn't much larger than a single doorway. Besides the blockhouse, wasn't the most amazing thing Derek had seen in his short memory. A huge gray machine rumbled softly, yet with undeniable strength and power. From it issued what could only be described as a ribbon of city. In 5-meter square slabs, the city appeared to be simply extruding from underground through the medium of the gray machine. It pushed itself along, slabs gradually forming and reforming as they moved. following some incredible pre-programming that let them build themselves. And as the slabs formed walls and floors and corners and stories and windows, they spun off in every direction in a slow, graceful dance that pushed against the already existing buildings, the mechanism that triggered the entire magnificent clockwork of Robot City. It was as if the entire city were one mammoth, living organism, always growing outward, always changing and replicating like cells in a body, moving in an imprinted patterns toward a complete, fully formed being. It was a plan of monumental scale, an atmosphere of total logical control for a given end. As he watched a skyscraper literally build itself from the ground up, each story pushing up the story above it, and self-welding according to some unseen plan, he experienced the grandeur of an idea so vast that his limited knowledge was humbled by its power. This civilization was the product of a mind that refused to believe in limited options, a mind that accepted what the imagination could conceive, the hands could make. To such a mind anything was possible, even, perhaps, perihelion. The truck lurched, nearly knocking him from his knees. It pulled up to the gate. The line of robots now reaching into his bed for their equipment. If all the action was happening below ground, that's where Derek wanted to be. Hurrying out of the truck, he grabbed a small terminal that looked as if it had been shorted out by water, and took his place behind a robot heading toward the door into the ground. He reached the doorway, cradling the computer like a baby. Warm air greeted him as he stepped in through the barely lit darkness. He was confronted by a short flight of stairs leading down, and followed the robot that walked down before him. The stairs terminated in a large holding area, brightly lit, frenetic with activity. Automated carts carried robots and mining equipment at breakneck pace. The cars zipped around one another in seemingly rehearsed fashion, their movements perfected over time, since it seemed impossible to Derek that they could move so quickly without hitting one another. On the far wall sat a bank of elevators, perhaps 20 in all, some of them remarkably large. Robots that moved down the stairs headed toward these elevators, apparently going from here to a lower level where repair or scrap work was being done. Having no idea of where to go, Derek chose an elevator at random and moved toward it with his burden. A large elevator nearby slid open, and a group of miner bots, covered with mud and soot, moved out bearing the non-operating carcass of one of their own above their shoulders. Derek reached the elevator. It had no formal controls, but opened for him as soon as he stepped near. A voice boomed behind him. "Nothing awaits you below but death." He turned to see a huge supervisor robot, twice the size of a man, glaring down at him with red photocells. The robot's body was burnished a bright shimmering black. "I've come to inspect your operation," Derek said, feigning authority. He turned back to the elevator and began to step in. The robot's arm flashed out, its mammoth pincers clanging loudly around Derek's forearm, squeezing tightly but not painfully. "You are caught," the machine said, and Derek's computer crashed loudly at his feet. And thus ends Chapter 3. This is a bit of a reflection, but is it just me, or is Derek slowly getting more curiosity over safety? Something to reflect on, because he's definitely a lot more active in this chapter, and reckless, and insane. Probably because he trusts robots more than anything else on the planet. Galaxy. Okay, that's the end.